The billionaire had already offered $5,000 before the pregnant woman even touched his engine. She simply shook her head, pulled a short piece of rusty baling wire from an old metal toolbox, and disappeared beneath the hood of his luxury SUV. 3 minutes later, the engine roared back to life on the empty dirt road in rural Kentucky. She wiped the grease from her hands, refused every dollar he held out, and quietly said, "Don't repay me today. Pass it on when someone else needs it." What Richard Harrison didn't know was that the woman walking away with that battered toolbox, Janet Rivera, was carrying far more than an unborn child. She was carrying a gift the world had stopped noticing. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if stories about ordinary people changing lives through extraordinary kindness speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining us for more. Every weekday, Janet Rivera's alarm rang at exactly 4:45 a.m., though most mornings she was already awake before it had the chance. Pregnancy had made sleep lighter, and worry had made it almost impossible. She would lie still for a moment inside the narrow trailer, one hand resting gently over the child, growing beneath her faded gray sweatshirt, listening to the familiar chorus outside. Crickets surrendered to birds. A freight train rumbled somewhere beyond the hills. Rainwater dripped from the rusted gutter that had needed replacing for nearly 3 years. She whispered the same quiet words every morning. One more day. The trailer was small enough that she could walk from her bedroom to the kitchen in 7 steps. The floor creaked beneath her worn work boots she had repaired twice, with heavy thread instead of buying another pair she couldn't afford. She switched on the yellow stove light, careful not to wake 8-year-old Ethan sleeping in the next room. Breakfast was never complicated. Oatmeal, 2 scrambled eggs, toast if there was enough bread left. Some mornings she sliced 1 apple into thin pieces so it looked like there was more than there really was. While the oatmeal simmered, Janet packed Ethan's lunch into an old blue lunchbox that had once belonged to her father. Peanut butter sandwich, baby carrots, a homemade oatmeal cookie wrapped carefully in wax paper. She always tucked a handwritten note inside. Be kind. Ask questions. I'm proud of you. Different words, same message. At exactly 5:30, she opened the small metal cabinet above the sink. Inside sat the only object she treated like a family treasure. An old steel toolbox. Its paint had long since faded. One corner was dented where it had fallen from a workbench years earlier. The latch squeaked every time she opened it. Inside were ordinary tools that looked almost worthless to anyone else. A weathered pair of pliers, 3 screwdrivers with worn handles, a cracked measuring tape, a folding utility knife, and tucked neatly into one compartment, a tightly wound roll of baling wire. She picked it up with unusual care. Her fingers paused on the rough metal. Instantly, another voice echoed inside her memory. If it can hold, it can hope. Samuel Rivera had said those words thousands of times. Her father had never owned an expensive repair shop. He had never become wealthy. People from neighboring farms simply knew that if Samuel couldn't fix it, nobody could. As a little girl, Janet had followed him from barn to barn carrying that same steel toolbox. While other children played in parks during the summer, she learned how engines breathed, how belts slipped, why bolts loosened, and how small failures became large disasters when people ignored them. Most importantly, she learned never to throw something away before understanding it. Her father would smile whenever neighbors apologized for bringing him broken equipment. Machines, he'd say, aren't much different from people. Most aren't beyond saving. They just need someone willing to look a little closer. Those lessons had shaped every part of Janet's life, even after Samuel was gone. She gently returned the wire to its place before closing the toolbox. At 6 o'clock, Ethan wandered into the kitchen, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Morning, Mom." "Morning, handsome." He noticed the slight wince she tried to hide as she leaned against the counter. "Baby kicking again?" Janet smiled. "She's practicing soccer." He laughed. "I think she's practicing karate." Their laughter filled the tiny trailer for a few precious seconds. Those moments mattered, because once the front door opened, reality always waited outside. After dropping Ethan at the small elementary school, Janet drove 12 miles to Miller Family Farm in her aging pickup truck. The faded green truck had over 280,000 miles on it and complained every morning before finally agreeing to start. She spent 6 hours feeding livestock, repairing broken irrigation valves, loading feed bags, and helping maintain old farm equipment whenever something refused to cooperate. Most workers called for replacement parts. Janet looked for solutions. By early afternoon, she clocked out, but her workday was only halfway finished. Word had spread throughout 3 neighboring towns that Janet Rivera could fix almost anything with an engine. Lawnmowers, generators, chainsaws, old pickup trucks, tractors older than she was. People often arrived apologizing. "I can't afford much," Janet always answered the same way. "We'll see what it needs first." That afternoon, an elderly widower named Harold Jenkins pulled into her gravel driveway with a generator that hadn't worked since winter. "I can pay maybe $20, he said nervously. Janet examined the machine. "It won't be 20. His shoulders dropped. "I knew it'd be more," she smiled. "It'll be 12. The old man's eyes filled with surprise. 12? "You already bought the replacement filter." He laughed so hard he nearly cried. An hour later, the generator was running smoothly again. Before leaving, Harold quietly placed a basket of fresh tomatoes on her porch. "I know you won't accept extra money." Janet looked at the vegetables. "I'll accept these." "It's all I can give." She nodded. "It's more than enough." By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered again above the Kentucky hills. Janet checked the time. Her prenatal appointment. She had almost forgotten. She hurried toward her pickup, turned the key. Nothing. Only a weak clicking sound. She tried again. Silence. She lifted the hood. The battery cable had finally given up. She stood there for a long moment. Repairing it properly would require parts she didn't own. The clinic was nearly 7 miles away. Missing another appointment wasn't an option. Her doctor had already warned her that this pregnancy needed close monitoring. Janet glanced back toward the trailer, then toward the quiet road stretching beyond the fields. Without complaining, without calling anyone to rescue her, she lifted the old steel toolbox into one hand, adjusted the worn strap of her shoulder bag with the other, locked the pickup, and started walking beneath the gray afternoon sky. Inside the toolbox, the roll of baling wire shifted softly, with every step tapping against the metal, like a quiet reminder of her father's voice. "If it can hold," Janet smiled, despite the distance ahead. "It can hope." She had no idea that somewhere farther down that lonely dirt road, a stranded stranger in an expensive SUV was about to discover exactly what those words truly meant. Richard Harrison had built one of the largest transportation technology companies in America by trusting numbers, sales reports, production charts, profit margins, quarterly forecasts. For more than 30 years, those numbers had guided nearly every decision he made. Investors admired him because he rarely acted on emotion. Employees respected him because he insisted on facts before opinions. Yet somewhere along the way, the facts had become strangely polished. Every report arriving on his desk painted the same optimistic picture. Rural expansion was progressing smoothly. Communities welcomed Harrison Mobility's investment. Skilled workers would be easy to recruit. Local infrastructure exceeded expectations. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. That was exactly what bothered him. At 56, Richard had learned that perfection on paper often hid problems no spreadsheet could measure. On a rainy Tuesday morning, he canceled the corporate helicopter that had been prepared for him. His executive assistant stared in disbelief. "You canceled the flight, sir." "I did. The regional directors have already arranged the welcome event." "I know." "They're expecting you at 11. Richard buttoned his dark navy jacket before picking up a simple leather overnight bag. "They're expecting the CEO." The assistant frowned. "Aren't you the CEO?" He smiled faintly. "Not today." Instead of traveling with executives' security vehicles, photographers, and local officials, Richard borrowed a dark gray luxury SUV from the company fleet. No company logo, no driver, no assistants, no announcement. Only his old road map folded across the passenger seat beside a notebook he still preferred over digital tablets. People often assumed billionaires loved luxury. Richard had once believed that himself. These days, silence felt far more valuable. 3 years earlier, after his wife Evelyn had died following a long battle with pancreatic cancer, the enormous mansion outside Chicago had become unbearably quiet. Board meetings filled his calendar. Charity dinners filled his evenings. Awards filled shelves he rarely looked at. Yet none of them filled the empty chair across his breakfast table. Work became easier than grief. So he worked, longer, harder. Until one evening, he realized he could no longer remember the names of the people assembling the vehicles carrying his company's logo across the country. That realization frightened him more than losing money ever had. If he no longer understood ordinary workers, then perhaps he no longer deserved to lead them. The highway gradually disappeared behind him as he entered eastern Kentucky. Rolling green hills stretched beneath heavy clouds. Old barns leaned slightly with age. Church steeples rose above clusters of modest homes. Closed coal facilities stood like forgotten monuments beside cracked roads. Richard slowed the SUV. This looked nothing like the presentation slides his executives had shown the previous week. According to those slides, new investment had already revitalized the region. Reality looked different. Several storefronts were empty. A grocery store displayed a handwritten sign seeking workers. A gas station had only 2 functioning pumps. An elderly man repaired a fence himself instead of replacing broken posts. Richard wrote quietly inside his notebook. "People repair because replacement is impossible." He underlined the sentence twice. A few miles later, he stopped at a small diner called Grace's Kitchen. The waitress poured fresh coffee without asking. "You passing through?" she asked warmly. "For now." She smiled. "Storm washed out part of Miller Road yesterday." Richard looked up. "Still open?" "Barely. You might want Highway 9 instead." "I appreciate the advice." Instead of taking Highway 9, Richard drove toward Miller Road anyway. Sometimes the harder road revealed the truth. Rain had softened the dirt into thick mud. The SUV's tires pushed carefully through deep ruts carved by farm equipment. Towering oak trees formed a tunnel above the narrow road. His phone displayed one lonely word. Searching. Then, no service. Richard chuckled softly. His board members would probably panic if they knew the CEO had intentionally driven beyond cellular coverage. Exactly 15 minutes later, the SUV shuddered. A warning light flashed across the dashboard. Engine power reduced. Richard frowned. He eased onto the shoulder. The engine coughed once, twice, then died completely, and silence settled over the woods. He waited a moment before pressing the ignition. Click. The starter turned weakly. Nothing. Again. Still nothing. Richard stepped outside. The humid afternoon air smelled of wet earth and pine trees. He opened the hood. Steam drifted upward. He recognized enough about vehicles to understand one thing. This problem wasn't something he could solve. He searched for roadside assistance. No signal. He climbed a small embankment. Still nothing. He walked 50 yards down the road holding his phone overhead. Nothing. For the first time in years, Richard Harrison found himself completely disconnected from the world. No assistance, no satellite office, no conference calls, no rescue arriving within minutes. Only birds singing somewhere in the trees. He laughed quietly at the absurdity. $1 billion can't buy 1 bar of reception. The words disappeared into the empty countryside. Minutes stretched into nearly half an hour. Not a single vehicle passed. Richard leaned against the SUV and loosened his tie. The expensive Italian leather shoes he wore collected red Kentucky mud. His white shirt clung to his back in the humid air. He checked his watch. His afternoon meeting with local officials had already begun without him. For the first time in decades, being late no longer mattered. The road itself had decided his schedule. A breeze stirred through the trees. Then faintly, footsteps. Slow. Steady. Crunching across damp gravel. Richard looked toward the bend in the road. A lone figure emerged from the mist left behind by the morning rain. A woman. She carried an old metal toolbox in one hand. Her other hand rested instinctively against the curve of her pregnant belly. Her jeans were faded. Her work boots were worn nearly smooth. A loose flannel shirt hung over a simple gray t-shirt. Despite the long walk, her pace remained calm, almost deliberate. She didn't seem surprised to find a luxury SUV stranded in the middle of nowhere. As she drew closer, her eyes moved once across the vehicle, then toward the open hood. She wasn't looking at the polished paint. She was studying the problem. Richard straightened instinctively. The woman stopped a few feet away. Without introducing herself, without asking who he was, she spoke in a quiet, matter-of-fact voice. "Looks like you've had a rough afternoon." Richard managed a tired smile. "You could say that." She glanced toward the silent engine once more. "If you don't mind." She gently lifted the toolbox onto the muddy ground. "I'd like to take a look." Richard hesitated. For a brief moment, every instinct built over decades of wealth and responsibility urged him to refuse. He didn't know this woman. He didn't know whether she actually understood engines or whether she simply meant well. The SUV alone was worth more than most homes in the surrounding county. "You've worked on these before?" he asked carefully. Janet Rivera didn't seem offended by the question. "No." Richard blinked. "No." She smiled faintly. "I've never worked on this exact model." Then she added with quiet confidence, "But every engine tells you what's wrong if you're willing to listen." It was an unusual answer. Not rehearsed, not boastful, just honest. Richard stepped aside. "If you're sure." "I'm not sure," she admitted. "I'm hopeful." She knelt beside the SUV, despite the wet gravel soaking through the knees of her jeans. Setting her toolbox beside her, she rolled up her sleeves and rested one hand against her lower back before leaning over the engine compartment. Pregnancy made every movement slower, but none of them seemed uncertain. She didn't immediately touch anything. Instead, she looked, she listened, she inhaled. Then she gently pressed a few components with practiced fingers. Richard watched in silence. Unlike the mechanics he usually dealt with, Janet wasn't rushing toward an expensive diagnosis. She seemed to be having a conversation with the machine. "What happened before it quit?" she asked. "A warning light came on." "What did it say?" "Engine power reduced." "Any strange noises?" A slight shudder. "Smoke?" "No." "Burning smell?" "Not really." She nodded. "Did you drive through standing water?" "A few puddles." She reached into the toolbox and pulled out a flashlight whose silver paint had almost completely worn away. Its batteries were weak, but the narrow beam was enough. After another minute, she quietly said almost to herself, "Interesting." Richard leaned forward. "What is it?" She pointed toward a section near the engine. "See this?" He frowned. "I don't." She smiled. "Most people don't." She carefully traced a cable with one finger. The vibration probably loosened this connector after the road shook everything around. Richard stared. That's all. Maybe. You don't sound convinced. I'm convinced that's one problem. You think there's another? I won't know until this one's fixed. There was no drama in her voice, only patience. She reached into the toolbox again. No replacement parts, no electronic scanner, no specialty equipment. Just simple hand tools that looked older than Ethan. She searched every compartment before quietly sighing. No spare clip. Richard immediately reached into his wallet. There's a town about 15 miles back. I'll pay whatever it costs if you can get someone to bring one. Janet gently shook her head. No signal. I'll walk. She looked down the endless muddy road. By the time you get back, it'll be dark. Richard exhaled slowly. So we're stuck. Maybe. She paused. May I borrow something? What? A short piece of wire. He looked confused. I don't carry wire. She smiled for the first time. I figured. Opening the smallest compartment of her toolbox, she removed the tightly wound roll of baling wire. The metal had lost its shine years ago. It wasn't expensive. It wasn't even particularly clean. But she handled it almost respectfully. Richard couldn't hide his surprise. You're fixing my SUV with that. I'm trying to get you safely to a real mechanic. That's different. It is. She cut off a small piece with worn side cutters. Her hands moved with remarkable precision. She carefully reinforced the loosened connection, twisting the wire into place with practiced movements so controlled they almost resembled sewing. Richard noticed something unexpected. Her fingers never trembled. Neither did her breathing. Even though she was visibly pregnant, even though she'd been walking for miles, even though she had every reason to hurry, she worked as though doing the job correctly mattered more than doing it quickly. When she finished securing the connection, she checked every surrounding cable again. Then she gently closed the hood halfway. Try it. Richard climbed behind the wheel. He pressed the ignition. The engine turned over. Once. Twice. Then. Silence. He looked back through the windshield. I'm sorry. Janet wasn't disappointed. She simply nodded. I expected that. Richard stepped back outside. So it wasn't enough? No. She reopened the hood. This tells us something. It does. The first repair held. How can you tell? Because the engine almost caught. She smiled to herself. Now we know where to keep looking. For another 10 minutes, she inspected the engine one section at a time. Finally, she stopped near another connection hidden deeper inside. There you are. Richard walked closer. What did you find? She pointed carefully. This wire rubbed against the housing. I still can't see it. You almost never can. She looked up. Small problems like hiding. Again, she reached for the roll of baling wire. This time she combined it with a strip of electrical tape from the toolbox and adjusted the damaged section just enough to prevent it from slipping. Nothing permanent, nothing unsafe. Just enough to restore stability until professional repairs could be made. She stepped back. This time, Richard returned to the driver's seat. He took one slow breath, pressed the button. The starter engaged immediately. A heartbeat later, the engine came alive with a smooth, confident rumble. The warning light disappeared. The idle settled perfectly. Richard stared at the dashboard in disbelief. No. He climbed out, almost laughing. It actually worked. Janet listened to the engine for several seconds. Leave it running. You don't trust it. I trust it enough to reach town. She walked around the vehicle, listening from different angles before finally nodding. You'll want the damaged connector replaced today. I will. And don't keep driving rough roads until then." Richard looked at her with genuine admiration. "You just repaired a vehicle worth nearly $150,000 with a piece of wire." Janet smiled gently. "No." She closed the toolbox. "I repaired it with experience. The wire just helped." Richard slowly reached into his jacket and removed a thick envelope of cash he carried for emergencies. He held it toward her. "Please." She didn't even glance at the amount. "I can't take that. You have no idea how much inconvenience you've saved me. I'm glad. This is the least I can do." She shook her head. "I didn't help you for money. Then let me thank you." "You already did." "When?" "You trusted me enough to let me try." Richard lowered the envelope. For the first time in years, someone had refused him without resentment, without fear, and without trying to negotiate. Janet lifted the toolbox once more, adjusted its weight in her hand, and turned toward the road. "I still have 7 miles to walk." Richard looked at her in surprise. "You walked here?" "My truck wouldn't start." "And you're walking to town?" "To the county clinic." Only then did Richard realize she wasn't simply carrying a toolbox. She was carrying a child exhaustion and an unshakable dignity that no amount of money could purchase. Richard watched Janet disappear down the muddy road until the curve of the hillside swallowed her from sight. The engine of his SUV continued to idle smoothly, but he made no attempt to drive away. Instead, he sat behind the steering wheel, with both hands resting on it, staring at the short piece of baling wire still holding the temporary repair together. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers. He had spoken before Congress. He had advised presidents and governors on transportation policy, yet somehow the most memorable lesson he had received in years had come from a woman who had refused his money and continued walking 7 miles for a prenatal appointment. He looked at the envelope of cash still lying on the passenger seat. It suddenly felt strangely heavy, not because of its value, because it had been useless. When Richard finally reached the county clinic nearly 40 minutes later, the parking lot was almost empty. A few pickup trucks sat beneath tall maple trees, and a volunteer was collecting shopping carts abandoned near the entrance. Richard spotted Janet immediately. She was sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench outside the maternity wing. Her steel toolbox rested beside her feet. She wasn't looking at her phone. She didn't have one in her hands. Instead, she was quietly knitting a tiny cream-colored baby hat with faded bamboo needles while waiting for her appointment. For some reason, that simple image stayed with him. She never wasted time. Every spare minute became something useful. He considered walking over. Instead, he remained inside the SUV. Today wasn't about introducing himself as Richard Harrison, billionaire and CEO. Today was about understanding who Janet Rivera really was. The following morning, after returning to Louisville, Richard called only one person. Not an executive, not an attorney, not a public relations advisor. He called Marcus Reed. Marcus had served beside Richard in the Marine Corps decades earlier, before becoming head of corporate security. More importantly, Marcus was one of the few people Richard trusted completely. "I need you to look into someone." Marcus chuckled. "That sounds less dramatic than the last time you said it." The last time involved industrial espionage. And this time, a woman named Janet Rivera. Marcus waited. "What did she do?" "She repaired my SUV." Silence. "That's why you're calling me." Richard smiled. "No." "Then why?" "Because I think everyone else has overlooked her." Marcus had learned long ago that when Richard used those words, he meant something important. "I'll leave this afternoon." "Don't interview her." "Understood?" "There. Don't let anyone know we're asking questions." "You want me to observe?" "Exactly." 3 days later, Marcus drove into the small Kentucky town where Janet lived. He left his expensive company vehicle in a nearby city and rented an aging pickup truck instead. Nobody paid attention to another dusty truck. That was exactly the point. His first stop was Grace's kitchen. The diner smelled of fresh biscuits, black coffee, and bacon. An older woman with silver hair tied neatly into a bun greeted him with a warm smile. "Seat yourself, honey." Marcus ordered coffee and eggs before casually asking, "I heard there's a woman around here who's good with engines." Grace Turner looked up immediately. "You mean Janet?" "So everybody knows her." Grace laughed softly. "Everybody with something broken." Marcus smiled. "She's that good." Grace placed fresh coffee on the table. "Better." "Certified mechanic." Grace shook her head. "Life certified." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "What does that mean?" "It means she'll fix your lawnmower, even if all you've got is $5. Marcus made no notes. He simply listened. Grace continued. "Last winter, old Mrs. Collins lost heat during that snowstorm." Marcus nodded politely. "Janet repaired the furnace." "How much did she charge?" Grace smiled. "A loaf of homemade bread." Marcus almost laughed. "Seriously, Janet said Mrs. Collins needed the money more." Grace leaned against the counter. "You know what bothers me." "What?" "People call her poor." Marcus waited. "They see the trailer, the old truck, the worn boots, but they never notice how rich she is in everything that matters." Those words stayed with Marcus. After breakfast, he drove toward Miller Family Farm. Several workers recognized Janet immediately. One older mechanic named Carl Henderson wiped grease from his hands before speaking. "Best mechanic around." Marcus asked, "Then why isn't she running her own shop?" Carl looked away. "Life." He explained how Janet had cared for her father until his final breath, how medical bills had swallowed nearly every dollar they had saved, how she had refused to sell Samuel Rivera's old toolbox because she considered it part of the family. Carl pointed toward an equipment shed. "See that combine?" Marcus nodded. "Dealer wanted $12,000. "What happened?" "Janet fixed it in 2 days." Marcus frowned. "12,000? Carl shrugged. "Cost us less than 200. And she charged? Almost nothing." Marcus couldn't hide his surprise anymore. "Why?" Carl smiled. "She said we'd already lost enough." By late afternoon, Marcus had heard nearly the same story from everyone he met. The volunteer firefighter, the mail carrier, the church pastor, the owner of the hardware store. Different people, different experiences. One conclusion: whenever something broke, people called Janet. Not because she was the cheapest, because they trusted her. That evening, Marcus parked across from Janet's trailer. He never approached. He simply watched from a respectful distance. Ethan jumped off the school bus carrying the familiar blue lunchbox. The boy ran toward his mother with a spelling test held high above his head. Even from across the road, Marcus could see the large red A at the top of the page. Janet hugged him tightly. Then the two of them spent nearly an hour repairing an old push lawn mower together beneath a shade tree. She never took over. She asked questions. "What do you hear? What do you notice? What do you think comes next?" The boy answered carefully each time. Samuel Rivera had once taught Janet the same way. Now she was passing those lessons forward. Marcus suddenly understood why Richard had become interested. This wasn't simply about a talented mechanic. It was about a teacher no one had recognized, a leader without a title, a woman quietly strengthening an entire community while asking almost nothing in return. That night, Marcus called Richard. "I finished." "And?" There was a long pause. Finally, Marcus said softly, "You didn't find someone who deserves charity." Richard listened carefully. Marcus continued, "You found someone the country can't afford to ignore." Richard stared through the window of his office toward the Chicago skyline. For the first time since that lonely dirt road, he realized that repairing his SUV had never been the most important thing Janet Rivera had fixed. Without even knowing it, she had begun repairing the way he saw people. Long before Janet Rivera became the woman everyone in 3 counties trusted with broken engines, she had been a little girl who believed every machine had a heartbeat. She was 9 the first time her father handed her a wrench. It was far too heavy for her small hands. "You don't have to be strong to fix something," Samuel Rivera had told her as they stood inside his weathered garage. "You just have to pay attention." The garage sat behind their modest farmhouse, its walls lined with shelves built from reclaimed wood. Coffee cans held loose bolts sorted by size. Old alternators hung beside worn belts. Every surface carried the smell of motor oil, pine sawdust, and years of honest work. Samuel never hurried through repairs. He insisted that Janet watch before she touched. "Listen first," he would say, placing her hand lightly against the side of an idling engine. She frowned. "I don't hear anything." "You will." A minute later, she noticed a faint metallic tapping. His smile widened. There it is. As she grew older, those lessons became a language only the 2 of them seemed to speak. While classmates spent weekends at football games or shopping malls, Janet preferred crawling beneath old pickup trucks beside her father. She learned to rebuild carburetors before she learned algebra. By 15, neighbors stopped asking for Samuel alone. They asked for Sam and his girl. Samuel always corrected them. "No," he'd say proudly. "One day you'll be asking for Janet." At 17, she graduated near the top of her class. A technical institute in Lexington offered her a scholarship in advanced diesel and electrical systems. It was everything she had dreamed about. Samuel celebrated by taking her to the county fair. They shared a funnel cake on a wooden bench while fireworks painted the summer sky. "You'll go farther than I ever did," he told her. She squeezed his hand. "We'll go." He laughed. "I'm too old for classrooms." "Not for cheering." That was the last carefree summer either of them would know. Only 4 months after classes began, Samuel started dropping tools. At first, he blamed fatigue. Then he struggled to button his work shirt. Soon his speech slowed. Doctors in Louisville finally gave the diagnosis neither of them had expected. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. There was no cure, only time. Janet drove back to Lexington after the appointment in complete silence. She parked outside her dormitory, but never went inside. Instead, she sat behind the steering wheel until sunrise. The scholarship covered tuition. It didn't cover losing her father. The next morning, she withdrew from the program. Professors pleaded with her to reconsider. One even suggested taking only a few classes each semester. Janet thanked them. Then she packed her belongings and drove home. Samuel was furious. "You quit." "I took a leave." "For me? For us?" "No." His voice cracked. "You are not throwing away your future because I got sick." She knelt beside his chair. "I'm not throwing it away." "What are you doing then?" "I'm postponing it." Samuel looked at her for a long time. "You know that's not how life works." "I know." Tears filled both their eyes. "But I also know I'll regret leaving more than I'll regret staying." For nearly 3 years, Janet became everything. Caregiver, mechanic, cook, bookkeeper, daughter. Every morning she helped Samuel dress before taking on repair jobs around town. Every evening she sat beside his bed, reading aloud from old repair manuals, because they reminded him of happier days. As the disease stole his strength, it never stole his humor. One rainy afternoon, he watched Janet repair an old tractor by herself through the garage window. When she finally came inside, covered in grease from head to toe, he smiled proudly. "You didn't ask for help." "I knew what to do." He nodded toward the toolbox. "And when you didn't?" She reached inside, pulling out the familiar roll of baling wire. "I remembered." Samuel smiled weakly. If it can hold. She finished the sentence. It can hope. It became their ritual. His body grew weaker. The words grew stronger. Samuel died quietly one October morning, while autumn leaves covered the yard in shades of gold and crimson. Janet buried him with his favorite work gloves folded beside him. But she kept the toolbox. She couldn't bear to part with it. The months that followed blurred together. Bills arrived faster than repair jobs. Medical debt consumed nearly every dollar she earned. Still, she refused to sell the garage. It was the only place where she still felt her father's presence. Around that time, she met David Rivera. He was charming, funny, easy to talk to. Unlike many people he admired, that Janet knew more about engines than he did. They married within 2 years. For a while, life seemed to soften. Ethan was born. Laughter returned to the old house. David found steady construction work. Janet repaired engines during the day and believed perhaps for the first time since Samuel's death that happiness had finally caught up with her. Then the construction company closed unexpectedly. Months of unemployment turned into arguments. Arguments became distance. Distance became silence. David wasn't cruel. He was simply overwhelmed. Every failed job interview chipped away at the confidence he had once carried so naturally. When Janet discovered she was pregnant again, she sat at the kitchen table holding the test with trembling hands. She smiled. David didn't. He stared out the window for a long time. I don't think I can do this again. Janet reached for his hand. We'll figure it out. But he slowly pulled away. A week later, he packed 2 duffel bags. He promised he just needed time. He kissed Ethan goodbye. He never returned. Months passed. Phone calls became shorter, then stopped altogether. The child support checks never came. Neither did explanations. People in town whispered. Some pitied Janet, others quietly judged her. Grace Turner silenced anyone who dared criticize. You don't know what she's carrying, Grace once said. They think she's carrying 1 baby. Grace shook her head. She's carrying an entire family. Janet never defended herself. She simply kept working. She fixed engines. She paid bills. She attended Ethan's school plays. She visited Samuel's grave every Sunday after church. And every single visit ended exactly the same way. She sat on the grass beside the simple headstone, resting one hand on her growing belly. I used the wire again today, Dad, she whispered. It held. The wind moved gently through the trees. Some people might have called it imagination. Janet preferred to believe it was an answer, because every time she stood to leave, she somehow felt lighter than when she had arrived. She never imagined that the greatest lesson Samuel had left behind wasn't hidden inside an engine. It was hidden inside her own resilience. And somewhere far away in Chicago, Richard Harrison was preparing to offer her something she had never asked for, but something her father had always hoped the world would eventually give her a fair chance to be seen. The invitation arrived on a Thursday afternoon, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope with no company logo on the outside. Janet almost mistook it for another medical bill. She opened it while standing on the porch of her trailer, Ethan sitting beside her with his math homework spread across an upside-down milk crate they used as a table. Inside was a single sheet of thick stationery. Miss Janet Rivera, I would appreciate the opportunity to thank you properly for your kindness on Miller Road last week. If you're willing, I'd like to meet you for coffee this Saturday at 10:00 a.m. at Grace's Kitchen. No obligations. No expectations. Richard Harrison. There was also a handwritten note at the bottom. I promise not to waste your time. Janet read the letter twice. She still had no idea who Richard Harrison really was. To her, he was simply the polite man whose expensive SUV had broken down. Ethan looked up. Who's Richard? The man with the fancy truck? The one you fixed? She nodded. He wants to buy you lunch. Coffee? Are you going? Janet folded the letter carefully. I haven't decided. That evening, Grace Turner stopped by with a container of homemade chicken soup. She often did that whenever she cooked too much, though Janet suspected Grace intentionally cooked extra. Janet handed her the letter. Grace adjusted her reading glasses. Halfway through, her eyebrows climbed. Oh. What? You really don't know who this is? Janet frowned. Should I? Grace looked at her for several seconds. Richard Harrison owns Harrison Mobility. Janet stared blankly. The truck company? The truck company? Grace laughed softly. Honey, that man practically owns half the freight industry. Janet blinked. Oh. That single word carried no excitement, only surprise. Grace studied her face. You're not impressed. I've met rich people before. And they still have engines. Grace burst into laughter. You really are Samuel's daughter. Saturday morning arrived with bright sunshine after nearly a week of rain. Janet wore the nicest clothes she owned. A clean burgundy sweater stretched gently over her pregnancy. Dark blue jeans without grease stains. Her repaired work boots. She almost wore a pair of inexpensive flats instead, but the boots were more comfortable. Besides, pretending to be someone else had never interested her. Grace's kitchen was unusually quiet at 10 o'clock. Richard was already waiting in a corner booth. He had traded the tailored business suit for dark jeans and a simple blue flannel shirt. Without the formal clothes, he looked less like a billionaire and more like an ordinary man who had spent too many years carrying responsibility. He stood as Janet approached. I'm glad you came. So am I. After they ordered coffee and breakfast, an awkward silence settled between them. Richard finally smiled. I realized something after you left. Janet tilted her head. What's that? I never even thanked you properly. You thanked me. I offered money. That's different. He nodded. It is. Their food arrived. Neither of them rushed to eat. Richard watched Janet bow her head briefly before taking the first bite. My father always prayed before meals, she explained. I still do. Richard looked down at his untouched plate. My wife used to. He hadn't said those words aloud in months. Janet noticed the change in his voice but didn't ask questions. Instead, she quietly waited. Finally, Richard spoke. Evelyn passed away 3 years ago. I'm sorry. So am I. The words came out with surprising honesty. Not polished, not rehearsed, just tired. For a while they spoke about ordinary things. The weather, Kentucky roads, old pickup trucks, good coffee. Richard found himself relaxing in a way he rarely did during business meetings. Eventually he reached into the leather briefcase resting beside him. He removed the same envelope of cash Janet had refused on the roadside. I'd like you to have this. She didn't touch it. I told you before. I know. It wouldn't feel right. This isn't payment. No. It's gratitude. Janet smiled gently. Gratitude doesn't need an envelope. Richard leaned back. I've spent most of my life believing every problem had a financial solution. And now, I'm beginning to wonder how many things I've misunderstood. Janet stirred her coffee slowly. My father used to say something. The wire? She looked surprised. You remember, if it can hold, it can hope. She smiled. He said it every day. What did it mean? Janet looked out the diner window before answering. When I was little, I thought he was talking about machines. And later, I realized he was talking about people. Richard remained silent. She continued. Sometimes all someone needs is one thing to keep their life from falling apart. A job? A friend? A teacher? A second chance. She looked directly at him. You don't replace the whole engine. You just keep it together long enough for hope to catch up. Richard felt the words settle somewhere deep inside him. They reminded him of Evelyn, Near the end of her illness, she had often said that kindness rarely arrived in dramatic moments. It usually arrived quietly, as a meal, a ride, a hand to hold. He suddenly realized Janet and Evelyn would have liked each other. He pushed the envelope back into his briefcase. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "Why didn't you take the money?" Janet answered without hesitation. "Because next week I'd still be the same person." Richard frowned slightly. "I don't understand. If I solve today's problem with your money..." She folded her hands around the warm coffee mug. "I'll still wake up Monday needing opportunities instead of favors." The sentence landed with extraordinary force. She wasn't asking for rescue. She wasn't asking for charity. She wasn't even asking for help. She was describing a difference Richard had overlooked for years. Money could relieve pressure. Opportunity could change direction. Janet smiled softly. "I don't need someone to save me." Richard looked into her steady brown eyes. "What do you need?" For the first time that morning she hesitated. Then she answered quietly. "A fair chance." Nothing more, nothing less. No dramatic speech, no tears, just 4 simple words spoken by someone who had carried her own burdens for years. Richard felt something shift inside him. He had arrived intending to repay a debt. Instead, he was leaving with a responsibility, not to Janet alone, but to thousands of people whose abilities had never been measured because no one had bothered to look beyond worn boots, faded toolboxes, or forgotten towns. As they stood to leave, Janet smiled. "Thank you for breakfast." Richard nodded. "No." His voice was almost a whisper. "Thank you for correcting me." She looked puzzled. "I thought I came here to repay kindness." He picked up his briefcase. "But I think I came here to learn what kindness actually looks like." Janet walked towards the door without realizing that this quiet conversation inside a small-town diner had just changed the future of Harrison Mobility and the future of countless people she had never met. Richard Harrison returned to Chicago on Sunday evening with something far more valuable than the notes filling his leather notebook. For the first time in years, he had a question that couldn't be answered by analysts, consultants, or quarterly reports. How many Janet Riveras had his company overlooked Monday morning began like every other. The executive conference room overlooked the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. A polished walnut table stretched nearly the length of the room. Fresh coffee waited beside neatly organized presentation folders. At precisely 8 o'clock, the senior leadership team took their seats. Daniel Brooks, Executive Vice President of Human Resources, Laura Chen, Chief Financial Officer, Nathan Cole, Head of Operations. Several regional directors joined through video conference. The first 40 minutes followed the usual routine: production targets, shipping forecasts, construction timelines, profit projections. Then Richard closed the folder in front of him. "I have one more topic." Everyone looked up. "Our Kentucky expansion." Daniel smiled confidently. "We're ahead of schedule." "I know." "The recruitment numbers look strong." "I've seen them." Laura added, "Financially, it's becoming one of our best investments." Richard folded his hands. "I drove through the region last week." The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel looked surprised. "You visited?" "I did." "I wish someone had informed us." Richard's expression remained calm. "That was intentional." No one spoke. "I took Miller Road." Nathan frowned. "The road washed out after the storm." "I know. It isn't on the recommended route." "I noticed." Richard stood and walked toward the large digital map displayed on the wall. "Our reports describe an area prepared for rapid growth." He paused. "What I saw was something different." He spoke without anger. That made everyone listen even more carefully. "I saw empty storefronts. I saw families repairing equipment because replacing it wasn't possible. I saw people driving trucks older than some of our youngest employees. I saw skilled workers we never counted because they don't fit our hiring model. Daniel adjusted his glasses. We recruit based on qualifications. Richard turned toward him. No. The room fell silent again. We recruit based on credentials. Daniel hesitated. Those aren't the same. No. Richard looked around the room. I met someone with extraordinary mechanical ability. Nathan asked, certified. No. Engineering degree. No. Factory experience. No. Daniel leaned forward. Then how do you know she's qualified? Richard answered immediately. Because she diagnosed a problem 3 mechanics probably would have solved with replacement parts. A few executives exchanged skeptical glances. Laura finally asked, Who is she? A woman named Janet Rivera. No one recognized the name. Richard wasn't surprised. Single mother. Pregnant. Works part-time on a farm. Repairs equipment across 3 counties. Daniel opened his laptop. I don't believe she's in our recruitment database. Exactly. Richard's voice remained steady. She isn't in any database. Nathan crossed his arms. One exceptional person doesn't represent an entire workforce. Richard nodded. You're right. He pressed a button on the remote. A new slide appeared. Not a financial chart, not a market analysis, just a photograph. An old steel toolbox resting on a wooden workbench. The executives looked confused. Richard explained. That toolbox belongs to Janet Rivera. Still no one understood. She repaired my disabled SUV using ordinary hand tools and a short piece of baling wire. Daniel couldn't hide his disbelief. With respect, Richard looked at him. Modern vehicles aren't repaired that way. No. Richard smiled slightly. They're diagnosed that way. He described exactly what had happened on the dirt road. Not dramatically. Simply. When he finished, no one interrupted. Finally, Laura asked, What are you proposing? Richard walked back to his chair. I'm proposing we've been measuring talent incorrectly, Daniel replied carefully. Our hiring standards protect quality. They also exclude people. They exclude unqualified people. Richard shook his head. They exclude undocumented ability. The distinction hung heavily in the room. Daniel searched for the right response. If we remove educational requirements, I didn't say that. If we ignore certifications, I didn't say that either. Richard opened another folder. What if we created an alternative pathway? The executives leaned closer. A practical skills assessment. Blind evaluation. No names. No resumes. No degrees shown to evaluators. Only real mechanical problems. Nathan looked intrigued despite himself. Like anonymous auditions? Exactly, Daniel frowned. But people without formal training may struggle with safety procedures. Richard nodded. Then we teach safety. We can teach standards. We cannot teach curiosity. He paused. We cannot teach integrity. We cannot teach the habit of solving problems instead of replacing them. Laura quietly closed her calculator. She had worked beside Richard for nearly 20 years. She recognized the tone. His mind was already made up. Daniel still wasn't convinced. This could become expensive. Richard smiled. So does overlooking talent. Another silence settled across the room. This time it felt different, less defensive, more thoughtful. Richard looked directly at Daniel. Tell me something. Daniel nodded. How many applicants did we reject last year because they lacked formal credentials? Daniel checked his laptop. Approximately 23,000. And how many were practically tested? Daniel hesitated. Very few. How many? Less than 200. Richard slowly repeated the number. Less than 1%. No one spoke. He continued. I've spent decades asking whether people deserved opportunities. His eyes drifted briefly toward the photograph of the old toolbox. I've started asking a different question. What question? Laura asked quietly. Whether we've deserved them. The room remained completely silent. Richard closed the meeting with one final instruction. I want a pilot program. Daniel looked up. For Kentucky. For Kentucky. Timeline. 30 days. What should we call it? Richard thought for only a moment. Then he smiled, remembering a woman who had refused an envelope full of cash because she wanted something much greater. Fair chance. The meeting ended. Executives quietly gathered their folders. Some remained doubtful. Some were curious. Daniel stayed behind. As the others left, he approached Richard. You really believe this woman is that extraordinary? Richard looked out toward the skyline. No. Daniel seemed confused. No, I believe there are hundreds like her. He picked up the photograph of the old toolbox. The extraordinary part, he smiled softly, is that we finally noticed one. Hundreds of miles away, Janet Rivera was finishing another long day, repairing an old tractor behind her trailer, completely unaware that a conversation inside a Chicago boardroom had just set into motion a decision that would soon reach her mailbox and ask her to prove not who she knew, but what she could do. 2 weeks passed before the second envelope arrived. Unlike Richard Harrison's handwritten invitation, this one carried the logo of Harrison Mobility in the upper left corner. The paper felt expensive. The printing perfectly aligned the language formal enough to make Janet think it had been mailed to the wrong address. She read the first paragraph twice, then a third time. You have been invited to participate in the Harrison Mobility Fair Chance Skills Assessment. No interview, no resume required, no educational credentials requested. Participants would complete practical mechanical challenges judged anonymously by a panel of engineers. Travel expenses would be covered. Janet frowned. It sounded legitimate. It also sounded impossible. She folded the letter and placed it on the kitchen counter while she prepared dinner. Ethan noticed immediately. Good news. I don't know yet. He climbed onto one of the kitchen stools. What's it say? She handed him the page. He read only the first few lines before smiling. They want you. They want someone. They mailed it to you. Janet laughed softly. They probably sent hundreds. Then why are you smiling? She stopped stirring the soup. I think I'm scared. Ethan looked genuinely surprised. You? She nodded. I know old tractors. I know lawnmowers. I know pickup trucks. I've never been inside a place like Harrison Mobility. Ethan shrugged with the simple confidence children often possess. They've never been inside your garage either. His answer lingered in the room long after dinner was finished. The following morning, Janet carried the letter to Grace's kitchen. Grace read every line slowly before placing the paper back on the table. So, you're going? Janet shook her head. I haven't decided. Grace folded her arms. Honey, that's not the same thing. What if I embarrass myself? Grace leaned across the counter. What if you don't? Janet looked out the window toward the quiet main street. I haven't taken a test in years. You've been taking tests every day. I have, Grace smiled. When old Mr. Jenkins brings you a broken generator. When the Wilson family calls because their tractor died during harvest. When your truck refuses to start. Life has been testing you for years. She reached over and gently touched Janet's hand. This one just happens to be indoors. 3 days later, Janet boarded a bus to Louisville. It was the first time she had left the county in nearly 4 years. She carried one overnight bag, her father's steel toolbox, and the familiar roll of baling wire tucked safely inside. Richard Harrison watched from an observation room as participants checked in one by one. He had insisted on remaining completely invisible. No candidate would know he was present, No evaluator would know which participant had repaired his SUV. Everyone would compete equally. That had been Janet's lesson. A fair chance, nothing more, nothing less. Nearly 60 candidates filled the training facility. Some wore mechanic uniforms. Others arrived in clean business clothes. Several carried certificates in expensive leather portfolios. Janet wore the same repaired work boots she always wore. Her toolbox looked decades older than every professional case surrounding it. She noticed people looking. She ignored them. A young receptionist greeted her warmly. Name: Janet Rivera. The receptionist handed her a numbered badge. Participant 27. No titles, no introductions, only a number. Janet appreciated that. Inside the workshop, Daniel Brooks addressed the group. There are 4 practical stations. You will rotate every 45 minutes. Evaluators will score only your work. We don't know your names. We don't know your backgrounds. We're interested only in how you solve problems. Janet quietly exhaled. Good. That meant nobody would pity a pregnant woman. Nobody would underestimate a farm worker. Only the work mattered. The first station involved diagnosing an engine that refused to start. Candidates received basic tools, no manuals, no hints. Some participants immediately began removing components. Others connected diagnostic equipment. Janet didn't touch the engine for almost 2 minutes. She listened. She watched. She smelled the faint odor of fuel. One evaluator whispered to another, Participant 27 isn't doing anything. The second evaluator shrugged. Let's see. Janet finally reached inside. She checked 3 simple connections, then asked for permission to crank the engine briefly. The supervisor nodded. The engine turned once before stopping. She smiled. There it is. Within 12 minutes, she identified 2 separate faults. She repaired neither. The instructions only required diagnosis. She refused to do unnecessary work. The evaluators exchanged surprised glances. At the second station, candidates repaired a damaged hydraulic assembly. Several participants immediately requested replacement parts. Janet examined the components, then quietly asked, Am I allowed to fabricate a temporary field repair if I explain its limitations? The evaluator looked intrigued. Yes. She improvised a safe emergency solution using materials already provided, carefully explaining why it would allow equipment to reach a proper repair facility without creating additional damage. Everything she said reflected practical experience, not memorized theory. The third station challenged candidates to identify hidden electrical faults. This time, even experienced technicians struggled. Janet closed her eyes for a moment. She remembered Samuel's voice. Listen first. She asked for the power supply. A faint clicking noise echoed beneath the panel, almost inaudible. She smiled. 5 minutes later, she found the damaged relay. The evaluator quietly circled one word on the scoring sheet. Exceptional. In the observation room, Richard noticed Daniel leaning closer to the monitors. She's remarkable. Richard didn't answer. He simply kept watching. The final challenge required teamwork. Groups of 4 received a malfunctioning utility vehicle and 90 minutes to restore it. Janet's teammates initially ignored her suggestions. One young technician even said politely, I've got this. She stepped back without arguing. 15 minutes later, the repair still hadn't progressed. Another teammate sighed. We're missing something. Only then did Janet speak again. May I ask a question? Everyone looked at her. What changed immediately before the failure? The group fell silent. Nobody had asked that. They retraced the sequence together. Within minutes, Janet identified the actual cause. This time, nobody interrupted her. By the end of the exercise, the utility vehicle started smoothly. One teammate laughed. I should have listened earlier. Janet smiled. We all got there. She never claimed credit. Late that afternoon, the evaluators gathered to compare scores. Without knowing anyone's identity, they ranked every participant. Daniel stared at the final results. Participant 27, first place, not by a narrow margin. By the highest practical score the assessment center had recorded since opening. Only after every score had been signed and finalized did Daniel receive the sealed list matching numbers to names. He opened it. His eyes widened. Participant 27, Janet Rivera. He slowly looked toward Richard, who had remained silent all day. Richard smiled, not with triumph, but with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't changed the outcome. He hadn't spoken to a single evaluator. He had only opened a door. Janet had walked through it entirely on her own. As Janet packed her father's old toolbox to catch the evening bus home, she still had no idea where she had placed. She only knew she had done her best. For the first time in many years, that felt like enough. Janet Rivera expected a polite rejection. Experience had taught her not to expect too much from opportunities that seemed too good to be true. So when another envelope arrived 5 days after the assessment, she placed it on the kitchen table and continued washing the breakfast dishes before opening it. Ethan stared at the unopened letter. "Aren't you curious?" "I am." "Then why wait?" She smiled. "If it's good news, it'll still be good in 5 minutes. And if it's bad, it won't hurt any less if I read it sooner." Ethan considered that answer carefully. "I think I would have opened it already." "I know you would." They laughed together. Finally, Janet dried her hands, sat beside her son, and unfolded the letter. She read silently, then stopped. Then read it again. Ethan leaned closer. "Mom." She handed him the page because she couldn't quite trust her own voice. His eyes grew wider with every sentence. "You came first." Janet blinked. "I did. You really came first." According to the letter participant, 27 had achieved the highest practical evaluation score in the history of Harrison Mobility's Fair Chance Assessment. But the offer that followed surprised her even more. It wasn't a mechanic's position. It wasn't a management role. It was an invitation to help build the very program that had evaluated her. 2 days later, Janet returned to Louisville for another meeting. This time, Richard Harrison greeted her openly in a modest conference room, rather than hiding behind observation glass. Daniel Brooks was there as well, along with Laura Chen and 2 program directors. Richard stood as Janet entered. "Congratulations." She smiled politely. "Thank you. You earned every point." "I hoped I had." Richard gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Please." Once everyone was seated, Daniel slid a folder across the table. "We'd like to offer you a position." Janet opened it carefully. The salary was more money than she had ever imagined earning. Health insurance, paid parental leave, retirement benefits, training opportunities. She quietly closed the folder. Richard noticed. "You have questions?" "I do." Daniel smiled. "Please ask anything." Janet looked around the room. "Why me?" Daniel answered first. "You earned the highest score." She nodded. "I understand that." Then she looked directly at Richard. "But why this position?" Richard didn't hesitate. "Because you don't just repair machines. You teach people how to think." Janet was silent. Richard continued. "I watched you during the team exercise. You never competed for attention. You asked questions. You listened. You made everyone around you better." He leaned forward. "That's harder to teach than mechanics." For a moment, Janet thought about Samuel. He had taught exactly the same way. Richard opened another folder. "We're planning to expand Fair Chance across several states. We want you to help design practical training." Janet took a slow breath. "This is generous. It's deserved." She shook her head gently. "I can't answer yet." Nobody seemed offended. Richard simply asked, "What do you need to know?" Janet folded her hands. "If I accept," she looked from one executive to another. "Who gets to apply?" Daniel answered confidently. "Anyone who meets the requirements." "What requirements?" He listed the basics: high school diploma, transportation, availability for full-time training. Janet listened quietly. Then she closed the folder again. "I'm sorry." Richard frowned slightly. "For what?" "I can't accept." Silence filled the room. Daniel looked stunned. "May I ask why?" Janet spoke calmly. "Because I wouldn't have qualified." Nobody answered. She continued. "When my father became sick, I left school. I didn't finish the program that should have launched my career. If fair chance had existed, then—" She smiled sadly. "I would have failed your first requirement before anyone saw what I could do." Richard looked down. She was right. Again. Janet continued. "There are mothers who never finished school because they had children. There are veterans who learned incredible skills but have no paperwork. There are farmers who repair equipment every day without formal certification. There are people caring for aging parents. They aren't less capable. They've simply lived different lives." Daniel slowly removed his glasses. The room felt very different now. Janet wasn't negotiating for herself. She was speaking for people who weren't in the building. Richard finally asked, "What would you change?" Janet answered almost immediately. "I'd keep standards high." Daniel looked surprised. "You would?" "Absolutely. No shortcuts. No lowered expectations." Richard nodded. "Go on." "But I'd change how people reach those standards." She began counting on her fingers. "Offer evening classes for working parents. Provide childcare during training. Allow applicants to prove skills before asking about diplomas. Create transportation assistance for rural communities. Let experience count for something." She paused. "And don't make people feel ashamed because life interrupted their education." Nobody interrupted. Laura quietly wrote notes. Daniel stopped taking notes altogether. He was simply listening. Richard smiled. "This is exactly why we asked you here." Janet looked puzzled. "You expected me to refuse? I hoped you'd tell us what we couldn't see." She laughed softly. "I seem to keep doing that." "You do." Richard stood and walked toward the large window overlooking the training facility. "When I first met you," he looked back over his shoulder, "I thought I needed to repay a favor." He shook his head. "Now I realize you're helping us build a better company." Janet walked over beside him. Outside, several trainees practiced diagnosing engines. Some wore clean uniforms. Others wore worn blue jeans, much like hers. She imagined dozens, then hundreds, perhaps someday thousands. Richard spoke quietly. "We'll make the changes." Janet turned toward him. "All of them." "We'll start with Kentucky." She smiled. "That's enough." Richard extended his hand. "So—" He waited. "Will you help us?" Janet looked at his hand for a moment before shaking it. "Yes. But only if this program never becomes charity." Richard nodded immediately. "It won't. It must become opportunity." "It will." Their handshake lasted only a few seconds. Neither of them realized they had just agreed to something much larger than a hiring decision. Over the coming years, that single conversation would reshape the way Harrison Mobility discovered talent across rural America. And at the center of it all would remain an old steel toolbox, a roll of baling wire, and a woman who had insisted that dignity should always come before generosity. The first Fair Chance training class opened on a cool September morning, inside an unused maintenance warehouse on the edge of Harrison Mobility's new Kentucky facility. There were no balloons, no television cameras, no politicians waiting to cut a ribbon. Richard Harrison had quietly refused every suggestion to turn the opening into a publicity event. If this program succeeds, he had told his communications team, its graduates will be the story, not us. 24 workstations stood neatly arranged across the concrete floor. Each held a basic toolbox, a sturdy workbench, safety glasses, gloves, and a small notebook. Nothing expensive, everything practical. Janet walked through the building nearly an hour before anyone else arrived. She rested a hand against the edge of each workbench, making sure every station felt welcoming rather than intimidating. She remembered how frightened she had been before taking the assessment. If she could ease that fear for someone else even a little, she wanted to. One by one, the trainees began arriving. Some stepped inside with confidence. Others lingered near the entrance, unsure whether they belonged. Janet recognized that expression immediately. She had worn it herself. The first person to introduce herself was a 26-year-old mother named Olivia Carter. She carried a diaper bag over one shoulder and held the hand of a shy 4-year-old daughter. "I'm sorry," Olivia said nervously. "The daycare called this morning. They canceled." Janet smiled. "You brought your daughter." "I almost stayed home." "Why?" "I didn't want everyone thinking I wasn't serious." Before Janet could answer, a volunteer from the childcare room walked over. "We've been waiting for her." Olivia looked confused. "For my daughter," Janet nodded. "Childcare is part of the program." Tears immediately filled Olivia's eyes. "No one's ever planned for someone like me." Janet gently squeezed her shoulder. "We did." Nearby, a former Army mechanic named Marcus Ellis arrived carrying a cane. A roadside explosion years earlier had left permanent damage to his knee. Since leaving the military, every interview had ended the same way. People noticed the limp before they noticed the experience. A third trainee, Luis Moreno, had spent nearly 15 years repairing farm equipment with his father, but had never earned a certification because his family couldn't afford technical school. Another participant, Denise Walker, had worked nights cleaning office buildings while secretly studying engine repair through library books. Each person carried a different story. Each story carried the same quiet question. Do I really belong here? At exactly 9 o'clock, Richard welcomed the class with a speech lasting less than 3 minutes. He didn't mention company profits. He didn't promise success. He simply said, every person in this room earned the right to be here. From this moment forward, your effort matters more than your past. Then he stepped aside. The rest belonged to Janet. She stood in front of the class without notes, without slides, without rehearsed corporate language. Instead, she placed one object on the nearest workbench, the old roll of baling wire. Several trainees exchanged puzzled looks. Janet picked it up carefully. My father carried this. She held it where everyone could see. When I was little, I thought this wire fixed machines. She smiled softly. I was wrong. Silence settled across the room. It fixes something much harder. She slowly walked between the rows of workbenches. This wire reminds me that not every problem begins with replacing everything. Sometimes the strongest repair starts by understanding what still works. She stopped beside Olivia. If someone tells you your life is broken because you're raising a child alone, Janet gently lifted the wire. Don't believe them. She turned toward Marcus. If someone thinks your injury erased your experience, she shook her head. Don't believe them. She looked toward Luis. If someone says your knowledge doesn't matter because it wasn't learned inside a classroom, she smiled. Don't believe them either. The room remained completely silent. Finally, Janet finished with the sentence every trainee would later remember. We're not here to pretend life hasn't been difficult. We're here to prove difficulty isn't the same thing as inability. No one applauded. They simply nodded, because every person in the room understood exactly what she meant. Training began with the simplest assignment imaginable, a rusty push lawnmower that refused to start. Several trainees looked surprised. One young man whispered, I thought we'd work on electric trucks. Janet overheard him. "We will. But first," she placed a hand on the old mower. "Learn to respect small machines." She explained that complex technology still relied on simple habits: observation, patience, listening, clear thinking. The lesson Samuel Rivera had once taught inside his weathered garage now echoed through an industrial training center. As the morning progressed, Janet rarely answered questions directly. Instead, she asked one of her own. "What do you notice? What changed? What happens if you test that idea?" The trainees gradually stopped looking toward her for solutions. They began looking at the machines. Richard watched from the back of the workshop. Daniel Brooks quietly joined him. After nearly an hour, Daniel smiled. "I finally understand." Richard glanced toward him. "Understand what?" "Why she scored so highly." Richard raised an eyebrow. "It isn't because she's the best mechanic." Daniel nodded slowly. "It's because she creates more mechanics." Richard smiled. "Exactly." During lunch, Janet noticed Olivia sitting alone outside the building while her daughter colored pictures beside her. She carried 2 sandwiches over. "Mind if I join you?" Olivia shook her head. "I almost didn't come." "What changed your mind?" "My little girl asked me something." Janet waited. "She said—" Olivia laughed quietly through moist eyes. "Mom, what if this is where people finally see how smart you are?" Janet looked toward the child drawing happily with a box of crayons. Sometimes hope arrived through children before adults were ready to believe it. That afternoon, the trainees tackled more difficult repairs. Mistakes happened. Bolts snapped, engines stalled, frustration appeared. Whenever someone apologized, Janet repeated the same words. "Mistakes are tuition. Just don't pay for the same lesson twice." By the end of the first day, nobody had become an expert. Nobody expected to. But something more important had changed. The uncertainty each trainee carried through the front door that morning had become determination. As everyone packed their tools, Janet quietly returned the roll of baling wire to her father's toolbox. Richard walked over. "Successful first day." Janet looked around the workshop where conversations and laughter still filled the room. She smiled. "No." Richard looked surprised. "No. This wasn't success." She gently closed the toolbox. This was the beginning, and for the first time since Harrison Mobility had broken ground in Kentucky, Richard realized the company's greatest investment would never be measured in vehicles built or profits earned. It would be measured in people who finally believed they belonged. By the middle of winter, the Fair Chance program had begun to develop a quiet reputation that no advertising campaign could have created. People heard about it across kitchen tables, inside church basements, at feed stores, in laundromats. Parents mentioned it while waiting outside elementary schools. Mechanics talked about it over coffee before sunrise. Veterans shared stories at the local VFW hall. Instead of asking whether the program was real, people started asking how they could earn a place in the next class. Janet preferred it that way. Hope traveled farther when ordinary people carried it. The first graduating class consisted of only 21 students. 3 had withdrawn because of family emergencies. None had failed. Janet insisted there was an important difference. Life interrupted them, she told Daniel Brooks. It didn't defeat them. Daniel quietly changed the program handbook. From that day forward, anyone forced to leave because of illness, military obligations, pregnancy, or caregiving responsibilities could return to the next class without starting the application process again. It was a small policy change. To Janet, those were often the ones that mattered most. One snowy morning, Olivia Carter arrived before sunrise, carrying a small cardboard box. Janet was organizing tools when she noticed her. "You're here early." Olivia smiled nervously. "I brought something." She opened the box. Inside lay an old carburetor covered with rust. "My grandfather kept this in his barn." Janet picked it up carefully. It doesn't belong in the scrap pile. Everyone else said it did. What do you think? Olivia looked down. I think it's waiting, Janet smiled. For what? For someone patient enough. That answer told Janet everything she needed to know. 3 months earlier, Olivia had doubted whether she belonged. Now she saw possibility where others saw junk. The lesson had taken root. Across the workshop, Marcus Ellis was helping another trainee adjust a hydraulic system. He no longer relied on Janet to answer every question. Instead, he knelt beside the younger student, despite the pain in his injured knee. What changed before it stopped working? The student frowned. I don't know. Marcus grinned. Then that's where we start. Richard happened to overhear the conversation during his weekly visit. He smiled without interrupting. Samuel Rivera's teaching had reached another generation, without ever meeting him. Later that afternoon, Daniel walked into Richard's office carrying several reports. I thought you'd want to see these. Richard looked up. Good news. Daniel placed the folders on the desk. Our retention rate. Richard opened the first page. 94%. He looked surprised. That's impossible. So did I. Daniel handed him another report. 87% of graduates are already employed. Richard raised an eyebrow. That quickly. They're receiving job offers before finishing. What about productivity? Daniel smiled. Higher than traditional recruits during the first 6 months? Richard leaned back. And absenteeism. Lower. He continued reading. Workplace injuries. Also lower. Employee satisfaction. Higher. Voluntary turnover. Half the company average. Richard closed the folder. Interesting. Daniel laughed softly. No. What? It's humbling? Richard nodded. I agree. Daniel hesitated before speaking again. I owe you an apology. For what? I thought this program would lower our standards. Richard remained silent. Daniel looked towards the workshop through the office window. It raised them. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then Richard quietly replied, No. Daniel looked confused. No. It reminded us what our standards were supposed to measure. A few weeks later, Harrison Mobility hosted an open house for local families. Parents wandered through the training center. Children climbed into display trucks. Graduates demonstrated repair techniques. Near one workbench stood Luis Moreno. Only 6 months earlier, he had doubted anyone would ever hire him. Now he wore a Harrison Mobility uniform with quiet pride. A middle-aged farmer approached him. Luis. Luis looked up. Mr. Dalton. I heard you work here now. I do. The farmer smiled awkwardly. I remember when I told your father trade school was a waste of money. Luis nodded. I remember. I was wrong. Luis simply extended his hand. Thank you for saying that. No bitterness. No triumph. Just grace. Janet watched from across the room. Moments like that couldn't be planned. They simply happened when dignity replaced resentment. Toward the end of the afternoon, Richard found Janet standing beside the old toolbox displayed during the event. You've been quiet. She smiled. I'm listening. To what? She looked around the building. Laughter echoed between the workbenches. Children asked endless questions. Graduates patiently answered each one. I'm listening to confidence. Richard followed her gaze. I don't hear it. You will. He smiled. My father used to say the same thing. She laughed. Maybe good teachers all sound alike. Richard folded his arms. You've changed this place. Janet shook her head. No. The people changed themselves. You gave them the chance. I gave them the same chance someone finally gave me. Richard looked toward Olivia, who was helping a little boy tighten a bolt with a small wrench. He wants to come here someday. Janet smiled. Then we should be ready. That evening, after everyone had gone home, Richard remained alone in the quiet workshop. Rows of clean workbenches stretched beneath the lights. On one bench, someone had forgotten a handwritten note. He picked it up. It belonged to Olivia. Across the top, she had written a sentence in blue ink. "My daughter doesn't say my job is cleaning anymore." Below it, another line. "She tells people her mom fixes the future." Richard folded the note carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Not as a company document. As a reminder, buildings could be constructed in months, factories could be expanded in years, but restoring a person's belief in their own worth that was work, measured not by calendars or profits, but by lives forever changed. Spring arrived gently across the Kentucky hills, painting the pastures with fresh green and filling the air with the scent of wildflowers. By then, the Fair Chance program had expanded into a second training facility, and Janet Rivera had become a familiar face to every new class that walked through its doors. Yet for the first time since the program began, she was preparing to step away. Her daughter was due within weeks. Every trainee noticed Janet moving a little more slowly. She still arrived before sunrise, still checked every workstation, still greeted everyone by name, but she no longer lifted heavy equipment herself. Instead, she taught with even greater patience, letting students do more with their own hands. One afternoon, Olivia Carter found Janet quietly reorganizing the old steel toolbox. "You should be resting," Olivia said. Janet smiled. "I've never been very good at that." Olivia laughed. "I noticed." For a moment they worked in silence. Then Janet removed the familiar roll of baling wire and held it in her hands. "My father used to say that tools remembered the people who used them." Olivia looked at the worn metal. "Do you believe that?" "I believe people remember how they were treated." She carefully placed the wire back inside. "That's even stronger." A week later, Janet woke before dawn with a pain she immediately recognized. She sat on the edge of the bed without speaking. Another contraction came. Not sharp. Steady. She quietly reached for the lamp. Across the hall, Ethan heard the movement. He appeared in the doorway, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" Janet smiled, despite the discomfort. "I think your little sister is tired of waiting." Within minutes, Grace Turner arrived after receiving Ethan's phone call. Richard happened to be visiting the training center that morning when Daniel received a message from Grace. Daniel walked quickly into the workshop. "Janet's gone to the hospital." Every conversation stopped. Richard smiled. "Then we have something much more important to celebrate than production numbers today." No classes were canceled. Instead, Olivia quietly stepped to the front of the room. The trainees looked uncertain. She looked even more uncertain. "I've never taught alone before." Marcus Ellis smiled from the front row. "You won't be alone." One by one, the graduates who had stayed behind to mentor newer students moved closer. Nobody had planned it. Nobody had assigned roles. The class simply continued, exactly as Janet would have wanted. Hours later, inside the county hospital, Janet held a healthy baby girl in her arms, tiny fingers wrapped instinctively around her mother's hand. Ethan stood beside the bed wearing the biggest smile Janet had ever seen. "She's so little," Janet laughed softly. "For now." "What are we naming her?" Janet looked down at the sleeping baby. "Hope." Ethan blinked. "Really?" she nodded. "Because that's what your grandfather spent his whole life teaching me." News of the birth spread quickly through the community. The following afternoon, flowers began appearing outside Janet's hospital room. Some came from neighbors, others from former trainees. One bouquet arrived anonymously with a handwritten card. "Thank you for helping us believe we belonged." No signature. Janet didn't need one. She recognized the handwriting. It belonged to one of the first graduates who had once nearly quit after failing an assignment. Late that evening, Richard arrived carrying a small wooden box wrapped in plain brown paper. No expensive ribbon, no company logo, just careful wrapping. Janet looked surprised. "Oh, you didn't have to come?" "I wanted to." He placed the box gently on the bedside table. "This isn't from Harrison Mobility. It's from me." Janet slowly opened it. Inside rested something she hadn't seen since the day Richard's SUV had broken down. The short piece of baling wire, preserved inside a simple glass display case. She looked up in confusion. "I thought—" Richard smiled. "When the dealership replaced the damaged connector, I asked the mechanic to save it." Janet stared silently at the tiny piece of twisted wire. "I know it isn't valuable." She shook her head gently. "It is." Richard continued. "I wanted to remind myself that the most important repair wasn't made to my vehicle." Janet felt tears gathering before she could stop them. Richard looked toward the sleeping baby. "That little piece of wire changed my company." He smiled softly. "And I think she's going to grow up hearing that story." Janet laughed through her tears. "Probably more than she'd like." Just then, Ethan carefully lifted the glass case. "Can I hold it?" Janet nodded. He studied it with remarkable seriousness. "This little thing," Richard smiled. "Sometimes little things do the biggest jobs." Ethan thought for a long moment. Then he looked at his baby sister. "I'll tell her." Janet reached over and squeezed his shoulder. "I know you will." The next morning, Janet insisted on reading every update from the training center before agreeing to leave the hospital. Daniel had emailed attendance reports, photos from the classroom, and one particular picture that made her stop. It showed Olivia standing confidently in front of a class explaining an engine diagram, while Marcus assisted another student nearby. No one looked lost. No one looked afraid. The program had continued without her. Not because she wasn't needed, but because she had taught others to lead. Grace noticed the smile on Janet's face. "What is it?" Janet turned the phone so Grace could see the picture. "They don't need me every minute anymore." Grace looked at the image. "Does that make you sad?" Janet shook her head. "It makes me proud." Because Samuel Rivera had never wanted a daughter who depended on him forever. He had wanted a daughter who could one day teach someone else. Now that dream had grown far beyond a single garage, a single family, or a single town. It was becoming something no one could own, only pass forward. 5 years later, the old warehouse where the first Fair Chance class had met was no longer large enough. What had begun with 24 workbenches had grown into a nationally recognized training center that welcomed students from across rural America. Similar programs had opened in Ohio, Tennessee, Missouri, and West Virginia, each following the same principle Janet had insisted upon from the beginning: measurability, not appearances, not circumstances, not the chapters of life people never chose. On a bright Saturday morning in early May, hundreds of people gathered outside the newly completed Samuel Rivera Center for practical skills. The building wasn't extravagant. Its brick walls blended naturally with the surrounding hills, and large windows filled the classrooms with sunlight instead of expensive decorations. Flower beds planted by local volunteers bordered the entrance. Students from earlier graduating classes had built the wooden benches themselves during advanced carpentry workshops organized by the community. Janet stood quietly near the back entrance before the ceremony began. She wore a simple navy dress beneath a light gray jacket. Her hair was tied neatly behind her head, and little Hope, now 5 years old, held tightly to her hand while asking endless questions about every truck parked outside. "Mom." "Yes." "Why are there so many people?" Janet smiled. "They came to celebrate." "Us." She gently shook her head. "No." "What then?" "Opportunity." Hope looked puzzled. "I don't know what that means." "You will. Nearby, 14-year-old Ethan helped volunteers direct visitors toward the auditorium. Taller now than Janet herself, he carried the same calm kindness that had once belonged to his grandfather. Richard Harrison watched the family from across the courtyard. Time had added more gray to his hair, but it had also softened something inside him. Years earlier, he had measured success by annual reports. Now he quietly counted graduates. More than 4,000 people had completed Fair Chance programs. Nearly every one of them was employed. Many had become instructors themselves. Some had opened independent repair businesses. Others supervised maintenance departments throughout the country. Statistics mattered. Stories mattered more. The ceremony began without fanfare. A local high school choir sang the national anthem. The county judge welcomed visitors. Several graduates shared brief memories of their first nervous day inside the original warehouse. Then Richard approached the podium. He unfolded a single sheet of paper before smiling at the audience. "I prepared a speech." Laughter rippled through the crowd. "But Janet once taught me that the simplest answers are usually the honest ones." He folded the paper again without reading it. "When I first met her..." He glanced toward Janet. I thought I had encountered someone who repaired an engine." He paused. "I was wrong." The audience remained completely still. "She repaired something much harder. The way I judged people." No applause interrupted him. Everyone simply listened. Richard continued. "This building carries Samuel Rivera's name because he taught one little girl that every machine deserved patience." He smiled. "She spent the next 20 years proving every person deserved the same." As Richard stepped away from the microphone, Daniel Brooks approached, carrying a long wooden case. Most people assumed it contained a ceremonial plaque. Instead, Daniel carefully opened the lid. Inside rested a small glass display. At its center lay the original piece of baling wire that had once held together Richard's disabled SUV on a lonely dirt road. The audience leaned forward. Janet's eyes immediately filled with tears. Daniel carried the display toward a stone pedestal standing beneath the entrance hall. The pedestal held no bronze statue, no portrait, only an empty space waiting for something meaningful. Richard invited Janet forward. She hesitated. "I don't think this belongs to me." Richard smiled. It never did. Together they placed the glass case onto the pedestal. Above it, carved into polished Kentucky limestone, appeared only 7 words. "If it can hold, it can hope." Nothing else. No company logo, no donor recognition, no list of executives. Visitors would never know who funded the building unless someone told them. Hope tugged gently on Janet's sleeve. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart." "Why is that little wire in a glass box?" Janet knelt beside her daughter. "Because sometimes people forget that important things don't always look important." Hope stared at the tiny piece of metal. "It fixed a car," Janet smiled. "Yes." "Only one." She looked toward Richard before answering. "No. It fixed many lives." Hope seemed satisfied with that explanation, though she probably understood only half of it. Inside the training center, graduates guided visitors through classrooms filled with active demonstrations. Olivia Carter now directed the instructor development program. Marcus Ellis supervised advanced equipment diagnostics. Luis Moreno managed agricultural machinery training. Denise Walker led evening classes for working parents. None of them had imagined these futures when they first entered the program, carrying doubt instead of confidence. Near the back of the building stood an old wooden workbench enclosed behind clear glass. Upon it rested Samuel Rivera's original steel toolbox. The paint remained chipped. The handle remained worn smooth by decades of honest work. Inside lay the familiar tools exactly as Janet had left them. Children pressed their hands against the glass while parents quietly read the small inscription nearby. Not every teacher stands in a classroom. Some teach with the work of their hands. As the afternoon came to an end, most guests slowly departed. The courtyard grew peaceful again. Janet remained behind for a few minutes, standing alone before her father's toolbox. Richard joined her without speaking. After a while, he quietly asked, "Do you think he'd be proud?" Janet smiled through tears that no longer embarrassed her. "I think he'd ask why everyone keeps making such a fuss over one little piece of wire." Richard laughed. "Probably." She rested one hand lightly against the glass, protecting the old toolbox. "My father always believed the repair mattered more than the recognition." Richard nodded. "And now?" Janet looked toward the classrooms where new students would arrive on Monday morning. "Now I know he was right. Because buildings would someday grow old. Machines would wear out. Even names carved in stone would eventually fade. But every person who walked through those doors believing they finally deserved a fair chance would carry Samuel Rivera's lesson far beyond Kentucky. And that was a legacy no passage of time could ever wear away. Nearly 12 years had passed since a luxury SUV had broken down on a muddy dirt road outside a forgotten Kentucky town. The road looked almost the same. The oak trees still arched over the narrow path. The red clay still clung stubbornly to boots after every rainfall. Spring wildflowers still pushed through the grass along the roadside, as if no amount of time could convince them to bloom anywhere else. Only the people had changed. Early one Saturday morning, Olivia Carter drove that familiar road in an aging service truck belonging to the Samuel Rivera Center for Practical Skills. She had been invited to speak at a community career fair in the neighboring county. Her toolbox rested on the passenger seat. Inside, beside modern diagnostic equipment, lay one simple item she never traveled without: a small roll of baling wire. Not because she expected to need it, because it reminded her who she wanted to become. A mile ahead, she noticed a compact family sedan stopped beside the road. Its hazard lights blinked weakly. A young couple stood beside the open hood while two children waited quietly inside the back seat. The father looked frustrated. The mother looked worried. Olivia slowed immediately. She pulled onto the shoulder and stepped out. "Morning." The man managed an embarrassed smile. "I'm afraid we're stuck." Olivia looked towards the engine compartment. "Mind if I take a look?" "You know cars," she laughed. "I know enough to know whether we need a tow truck." The children watched curiously through the window as Olivia listened to the engine check a loose electrical connection and searched through her toolbox. The repair wasn't identical to the one Janet had made years earlier. Machines were different. Problems were different. But one thing remained exactly the same. Sometimes a tiny solution kept an entire journey from ending. Olivia removed a short piece of baling wire. Within minutes, she secured the damaged connection well enough for the family to reach the nearest repair shop safely. The father turned the key. The engine started immediately. Relief spread across every face. "You saved our vacation," the little girl in the back seat exclaimed as she climbed out to hug her mother. The father reached quickly for his wallet. "Please," he said, "at least let me pay you." Olivia looked at the folded bills. For a brief second, she remembered another woman, another road, another lesson. She gently closed the man's hand around the money. "I can't take it." "You have to." "I really don't." "You spent your time helping complete strangers." Olivia smiled. "So did someone else once." The father looked confused. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward the repaired engine. "A long time ago, someone helped a stranger on a road a lot like this." "And she refused payment." The man waited. Olivia repeated the sentence she had heard Janet say years before. "Don't repay me today." She smiled warmly. "Pass it on when someone else needs it." For a moment, nobody spoke. Then the little girl looked up at her father. "We can do that?" He nodded slowly. "I think we can." Olivia watched the family drive away before returning to her own truck. She never expected to see them again. She didn't need to. That wasn't how kindness worked. Later that afternoon, Janet stood inside the Samuel Rivera Center, watching a new group of students complete their first practical exercise. She was no longer the primary instructor. She rarely stood at the front of the classroom anymore. Instead, she quietly observed from the back, while younger instructors guided each lesson with confidence. Hope, now a curious middle school student, wandered through the workshop carrying a notebook. "Mom," Janet looked up. "Yes, our history teacher asked us to write about someone who changed our life." Janet smiled. "That's a wonderful assignment." "I picked Grandpa Samuel." "You did?" Hope nodded. "Even though I never met him." Janet felt her throat tighten. "What are you going to write?" Hope thought for a moment. "I'm going to write that he fixed engines." She paused. "And he fixed people." Janet gently brushed a strand of hair away from her daughter's face. "He'd like that." Across the room, Ethan entered, wearing the Navy work shirt of a senior systems engineer at Harrison Mobility. He had finished college without debt, thanks to scholarships he had earned through years of hard work. Instead of accepting offers from larger cities, he had chosen to return home. Richard often joked that Ethan had inherited his grandfather's patience and his mother's stubbornness. Ethan considered that a compliment. Richard himself had officially retired the previous year. He still visited the center every month, never announcing his arrival. Students usually recognized him only after someone quietly whispered his name. He preferred it that way. On this particular afternoon, he found Janet standing before the glass display that held the original piece of baling wire. The sunlight shining through the entrance windows reflected softly against the tiny strand of twisted metal. Richard stopped beside her. "Hard to believe." Janet smiled. "Sometimes. You know." He looked at the display. "I've often wondered what would have happened if my SUV hadn't broken down that day." Janet laughed quietly. "You probably would have made your meeting." "I would have." "And I would have missed the most important appointment of my life." Neither of them spoke for a while. Students laughed somewhere deeper inside the building. Tools clicked against metal. Someone successfully started an engine for the first time, and cheers echoed through the workshop. The sounds filled the air with quiet purpose. Janet finally spoke. "My father always said, every repair tells another story." Richard nodded. He was right. She looked once more at the little piece of wire inside the glass. It was never about fixing a vehicle. No. It was about refusing to let hope break. Richard smiled. And now, Janet turned toward the workshop where another generation was learning not only how to repair machines, but also how to recognize worth in people others overlooked. Now hope doesn't need that wire anymore. Richard followed her gaze. It has people. As evening settled over the Kentucky hills, the lights inside the Samuel Rivera Center remained on. Another class continued learning. Another future quietly took shape. Another act of kindness waited to begin. Perhaps somewhere years from now, another broken-down traveler would meet another stranger carrying an ordinary toolbox. Perhaps another child would hear the words, "Don't repay me today. Pass it on when someone else needs it." And perhaps they would never know where those words began. Because the greatest acts of kindness are not remembered by the names attached to them. They are remembered by the lives they continue to change. Sometimes we spend so much time waiting for someone to rescue us that we forget. The greatest gift isn't rescue at all, it's opportunity. Janet Rivera never asked to be saved. She asked only for a fair chance to let her ability speak louder than her circumstances. Richard Harrison discovered that generosity becomes truly meaningful when it creates independence instead of dependence. A single piece of baling wire was never valuable because of the metal it contained. It became priceless because it represented hope, dignity, and the belief that broken things and broken dreams can still move forward when someone chooses to care. Every person you meet is carrying a story you cannot see. Before judging someone by their clothes, their job, or the place they come from, take one more moment to look closer. You may discover talent hidden beneath hardship, wisdom behind quietness, or courage disguised as ordinary perseverance. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness becomes the beginning of a future you could never imagine. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know where you're watching from and what lessons stayed with you the most. Share it in the comments so others can read your thoughts too. And if you believe stories like this remind us of the best humanity has to offer, please consider sharing this video with someone who might need a little hope today. Don't forget to subscribe and join us for more stories that celebrate compassion, resilience, and the quiet power of ordinary people.